London's winter night was a grand, damp, and cold torture. The fog from the Thames, carrying the scent of metal and river silt, seeped through the gaps in the French windows, mingling with the dazzling lights of Canary Wharf to form a veil of haze. Natalie sat across from Evan, the unfolded divorce papers only half an arm's length away, yet she felt as if an entire lifetime lay between them. Evan pushed the document over with a gesture of weary condescension, as if he were not ending a marriage but clearing away a piece of cumbersome old furniture. He leaned back against the leather chair, loosened his tie, and tilted his chin slightly, revealing the angle that had once made Natalie's heart flutter. "Vivian is back," he said, his voice flat, as if stating a weather report. "I owe her an explanation." Natalie didn't look at the agreement. Her gaze settled on the faint ring mark on Evan's ring finger. They had been married for 7 years, and his motion of taking off the ring was practiced, as if it weren't his first time. In her past life, she would have broken down at this point, trembling as she pulled out the code she'd stayed up all night to revise for him, asking why over and over again. But now, she only tasted a stale, metallic bitterness rising in her throat, the flavor of tears that had flowed backward and dried inside. "The Tianxian project at Xingyuan," Natalie began, her voice steady even to her own surprise. "Its core algorithm relies on an outdated time series engine at its foundation. That was a patent you bought out 3 years ago from a bankrupt little company, right?" Evan raised an eyebrow, a faint smile curling at the corner of his mouth, as if an adult had just heard a child recite the multiplication table. "So what? If the market accepts it, that's enough. Natalie, don't try to judge business with your lab theories." He picked up his pen and scrawled his name across the signature line with a flourish, his posture arrogant. Natalie's gaze shifted away from his face and landed on the blank space of the agreement. She took her own pen, but instead of touching the signature line, she quickly scrawled a string of characters along the edge of the page, like an incomplete mathematical formula, or fragments of some kind of code, messy yet precise. It was the core logic fragment of the Phase 7 architecture, something she had honed with blood and tears alone in her office on the night before her death in her past life, which later became the holy grail that the entire industry scrambled for after Xingyuan's collapse. Evan glanced at it and let out a sneer. "Writing those formulas that no one can understand again? Natalie, that's about all you're good for." He snatched the paper away, crumpling it along with the characters she'd written, and tossed it into the wastebasket. The silver wedding ring clinked lightly and coldly as it landed on the folder. Natalie took off the ring and placed it on the table beside the crumpled ball of paper, her fingertip tracing the inner engraving of LNS1 last time. It now felt like a cynical epitaph. She stood up, pushing her chair back gently. When she reached the door, she turned to glance at the man, who was already pulling out his phone, probably texting Vivian. The thought in her heart pierced through her chest like a venom-tipped needle, slow and deliberate. "You mistook pearls for fish eyes, so I'll make you raise those fish eyes into poison with your own hands, and then watch it eat away at everything you live for." The door clicked shut behind her. The motion sensor light in the stairwell was broken, and in the darkness she pulled out her phone. As the screen lit up, an encrypted message popped up, from her legal team registered in an offshore jurisdiction. "Silver Creek Capital registration complete. Initial capital pool is in place. Additionally, the complete architecture of Phase 7 was anonymously released via open-source channels 3 days ago. The core modules are currently ranked number 1 on the GitHub trending list." Natalie stood in the dark, suddenly recalling that snowy night in her past life. She lay on the cold laboratory floor, her final sight the Phase 7 prototype she had poured her heart and soul into, now credited under Evan's name. And the knife lodged in her chest, its handle engraved with the word trust. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, the lights of Canary Wharf below dissolved into a warm, fractured glow through the mist. "This time," she said softly, her voice dissolving into the echoes of the stairwell, "I'm going to tear out every single brick beneath your feet." In the Victorian penthouse apartment in South Kensington, the dull hum of central air conditioning reverberated beneath the vaulted ceiling. 7 days after moving in, Natalie had not once drawn the curtains. The living room had been transformed into a neurotic war room, three curved screens formed an arc around an ergonomic chair, the walls plastered with Xingyuan's organizational chart annotated in red marker, capital flow maps, and technology dependency nodes marked with color-coded pins. On the floor lay takeout boxes, cups of cold coffee, and a mug that had been shattered and taped back together, its cracked spider webbing over the words best wife. She was obsessive to the point of pathology. At 3 a.m, as all of London slept, she stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, repeatedly debugging a section of code, her fingertips gliding precisely across the trackpad, pupils reflecting the data streams jumping across the screen, like some nocturnal predator. At 5 a.m, she would lace up her running shoes and dash into Hyde Park, sprinting along the frost-covered edges of the grass, her breath turning to mist in the cold air, her mind consumed with algorithmic optimization paths. Even while running, she could solve 3 math problems simultaneously. What Evan had once derided as a bookworm's uselessness was now her arsenal of revenge. At dawn on the 7th day, she finally completed the last piece of the puzzle. On the screen was a bone-chillingly detailed analysis of Xingyuan's technological trump card. Evan's vaunted Tianqian system, dazzling on the surface, relied heavily on a core timing engine module she had written for him in her previous life, code that, after her accidental departure, no one could maintain, and was now riddled with flaws. What was even more devastating was that she had tracked down 3 suspicious transfers totaling £7 million, flowing from Xingyuan's R&D accounts to a Cayman Islands registered gallery investment company, with the ultimate beneficiary being Vivian. Natalie stared at that transfer record. The cold light from the screen illuminated her face, tracing a taut line along her jaw. That scene from her past life surged forward, like a bucket of ice water over her head. It was the night before Xingyuan's series of funding round. Evan, crippled with anxiety, had been pacing back and forth in his office, unable to sleep. Natalie walked in with her laptop, the screen displaying a dynamic scheduling module she had written after 72 straight hours of work, the precursor to Phase 7, capable of boosting Tianquan's efficiency by 40%. Use this. She pushed the code across the table, her voice hoarse yet gentle. Think of it as a gift from me. Evan's expression at that moment was one she would never forget: surprise, greed, and a fleeting trace of guilt. He hugged her and said, "Natalie, what would I do without you?" Later, that module became the core barrier of Xingyuan, and when Evan secured funding, he told investors, "This is the collective achievement of our technical team," without even mentioning her name. Natalie convinced herself at the time, as husband and wife, his glory was hers. That is, until she saw a photo on Vivian's social media, Evan raising a glass at the celebration banquet, Vivian clinging to his arm, with the caption, "Standing at the top of the world with my Evan." Meanwhile, Natalie had been in the lab fixing bugs until 4 a.m. that day, never even stepping foot inside the celebration. Memories were like a dull knife, slowly slicing open a healed scar. Natalie turned off the screen and took a deep breath. Outside her apartment, London's skyline began to emerge in the morning light, the outline of Big Ben gradually sharpening. She picked up her phone and sent a voice message to her legal team: "Prepare the first round of investment proposal in the name of Silver Creek. Target, Xingyuan Technology. Also, schedule a meeting with Xingyuan's finance director, Charles." She paused for a moment, gazing out at the gray-blue sky beyond the window, a faint curve forming at the corners of her mouth. The Gentle Poison Plan, Phase 1, initiated. Natalie chose a Japanese restaurant near Canary Wharf, on the top floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows framed the harbor mist that hung in the air. The Thames wound through the view like a deep gray silk ribbon. She sat in a private room, a glass of chilled sake before her, beads of condensation sliding slowly down the glass, leaving transparent trails behind. Charles arrived 10 minutes earlier than she had anticipated. The finance director, in his 50s, wore a slightly outdated navy blue suit, and his handshake was damp with sweat. Natalie could tell that Xingyuan was recently under significant pressure on its cash flow, with the board breathing down his neck. "Mr. Charles," Natalie poured his tea with a fluid, practiced motion, "Silver Creek is very interested in Xingyuan's Tianqian project." Charles's eyes lit up, but then narrowed with wariness. I've looked into Silver Creek, a newly registered fund with a mysterious background. Miss Natalie, forgive my bluntness, but I need to know your sincerity. Natalie smiled, though the warmth didn't reach her eyes. She pulled a beautifully bound document from her briefcase and slid it across the table. This is our preliminary letter of intent for investment. £30 million, to be injected in 2 phases. No interference in management, we only request the introduction of 1 advisory engineer at the technical integration level. Of course, their salary will be paid by us. Charles's fingers trembled slightly as he flipped through the document. 30 million, just enough to fill Xingyuan's most urgent cash flow gap. And that clause about no interference in management felt like a godsend falling from the sky. When he closed the file, Natalie noticed him lick his lips, a physiological tell of temptation. Consulting engineer. Charles hesitated. Derek, Cambridge PhD, spent 3 years as an architect at DeepMind before this. Natalie took a sip of sake, the liquid carrying a subtle bitterness as it touched her lips, mingling with the faint sea salt lurking in the damp, cold air outside the window. A pure technical talent, nothing but good for your company. Charles finally nodded. As they clinked glasses, Natalie saw his dilated pupils through the rim of her glass, reflecting a vision of the future, unaware that the vision was cast in poisoned syrup. A week later, Derek joined Xingyuan. The soft-spoken young man in black-rimmed glasses quickly won Evan's trust. He solved a memory leak issue that had plagued the team for 2 weeks, boosting efficiency by 15%. Evan patted him on the shoulder at the weekly meeting, saying, "This is the top-tier talent we need," completely unaware that the man he was commending in public was at that very moment sending a progress report to an encrypted email address. Natalie sat in her apartment, opening the server logs Derek had sent back. The scrolling data stream on the screen looked like strings of code, and she read line by line, pressing the tip of her tongue against her palate, tasting a familiar, cold sweetness. He's starting to get addicted to the poison I gave him. She turned off the screen and casually clicked on the financial news. Xingyuan's stock price had risen slightly for 3 consecutive days, with the comment section full of optimism. Another headline showed that Vivian's gallery had just received an anonymous art fund injection and was preparing for a Southeast Asia tour. Natalie zoomed in on the accompanying image. Evan stood at the unveiling ceremony of Vivian's new painting, sharp in his suit, beaming with a bright smile, entirely unaware that in the background of the painting, a particular shade of blue exactly matched the interface color of the early version of Phase 7. Natalie closed the page and reopened the code editor. The poison has already been administered, all that's left is to wait for it to take effect slowly. Knightsbridge, the private club, the Oak Room. Natalie had only come to meet a potential investor, but in a corner of the cocktail party, she stumbled upon a pair of hunter's eyes. The man leaned against the oak bar, a glass of whiskey in his hand, an ice cube slowly spinning in the amber liquid. He was tall, wearing a well-tailored dark gray suit, the platinum cufflinks on his sleeves glinting under the light. Natalie noticed the way he looked at her, not the gaze of a man appraising a woman, but the fleeting spark of excitement in a chess player's eyes when they spot another worthy opponent. She walked over and sat on the bar stool beside him, ordering a soda water. "Hayes from Polaris Capital?" Natalie spoke first. "You're looking at Xingyuan's materials." Hayes smiled, the corners of his eyes curving into a sharp arc. The tablet in his hand was placed screen down on the bar, but before he flipped it over, Natalie had already caught the familiar logo, the cover of Xingyuan Technology's financial annual report. "Miss Natalie's eyesight is even sharper than I imagined," he said, his voice low, carrying the kind of composure honed by in British education. "So this is where the new shark from Silver Creek has been hiding." The two locked eyes for a moment across the bar's light. Natalie suddenly realized that this man had not only seen through her capital injection maneuver but might even have guessed at something deeper, those fragments of Phase 7 she had disguised as open-source code, and the modules she had asked Derek to embed into Tianqian, which seemed like optimizations but were actually ticking time bombs. "Cooperation or competition?" Natalie asked directly. Hayes set down his glass, leaning slightly forward, the platinum on his cuff catching the silhouette of her profile. Polaris is also making moves in the tech track. I've seen your open-source Phase 7 kernel, and I know that thing doesn't belong in the hobby project collection of an offshore fund founder. His voice lowered, taking on a conspiratorial intimacy. Natalie, you want to dismantle Xingyuan's platform, and I want to build a new tower on the ruins. Shouldn't we be talking about a price between us? Natalie didn't answer immediately. She picked up her soda water, ice cubes clinking against the glass with a crisp sound. Outside the window, the night over Knightsbridge was thick, occasionally punctuated by the low growl of a sports car rumbling down the street. She thought for 3 seconds, then said, "The technical bottom line is mine, the commercial profits are yours. What I want is for Evan to watch with his own eyes as what he thought was a glass bead turns into a pearl, and that pearl is the sword piercing his heart." Hayes raised an eyebrow and extended his hand toward her. Their hands met in midair, dry palms, distinct knuckles, a subtle current passing through the moment their palms touched, but neither lingered for even a second. It was the brush of fingertips between equal hunters exchanging coordinates of their prey. The party broke up after midnight. Hayes insisted on seeing her home, his black Aston Martin gliding through the rain-soaked streets of South Kensington. The pavement glistened wetly, reflecting the orange street lights, and the air carried the scent of freshly turned earth mingled with the lingering metallic tang of rain. The car pulled up outside her apartment building. Natalie unbuckled her seatbelt, about to step out, when Hayes spoke. "I work with a lot of people," he said, turning to look at her, his eyes catching the faint glow from the dashboard. "But the first one to turn a bad hand into a royal flush? That's you." Natalie pushed open the car door. A gust of cold air rushed in, dispersing the mingled scents of leather and men's cologne. She turned back with a smile, the curve of her lips flickering uncertainly under the streetlight. "Then you'd better hold on tight, Mr. Hayes. With this hand, I'm going to flip the whole table." The door closed, and the engine's hum faded into the distance. Standing in the warm light of the apartment lobby, Natalie heard the soft click of the fingerprint lock releasing. She glanced down at her palm, where the sensation of that handshake still seemed to linger, balanced, restrained, and touched with a faint tremor she thought she'd never feel again, the tremor of recognizing a kindred soul. The following spring, London Excel Exhibition Centre. A massive banner for the Global Tech Summit hung from the dome, the silver lettering of Tianqian, the next-generation intelligent decision system embedded against a deep blue backdrop, dazzlingly bright. Crystal chandeliers bathed the entire main hall in light as bright as day. Seated in the audience were hundreds of investors and technical experts from North America, Europe, and Southeast Asia. Camera tracks glided slowly along the aisles, sending every detail to the global livestream. Evan stood at the center of the stage, the spotlight following his upright posture. Behind him, the real-time data stream of Tianqian cascaded like a waterfall, smooth curves, impressive metrics, every parameter meticulously tuned. Yes, tuned. Natalie sat in the special advisory seat in the first row, her fingertips tapping lightly on her knees, like a musician silently counting the beats of the prelude in their mind. Tianqian redefines the boundary between AI and financial decision-making, Evan's voice carried through the microphone, confident, resonant, with a well-concealed excitement. "We are not just followers of technology, we are creating the standards." Thunderous applause erupted from the audience. Behind and to the side of Natalie, a representative from a North American institution was rapidly typing on their phone, likely reporting to headquarters that Xing far exceeded expectations. The real-time stock price flickered on another side screen, the numbers climbing steadily, while the comment section overflowed with praise. Even Vivian had come, seated in the second row by the aisle, wearing a water-green Chanel suit, a string of pearls around her neck glowing softly under the lights, pearls Evan had won at an auction last year for a six-figure sum in pounds, a receipt Natalie had seen in her past life. Natalie tilted her head slightly, her gaze sweeping across Vivian's profile. That woman was smiling in Evan's direction, the coral lipstick on her lips matching the exact shade of the Tianqian logo on the live broadcast screen. Natalie withdrew her gaze, looked down at her watch, there were still 12 minutes until the scheduled Q&A session. Her phone vibrated in her bag. She glanced at it discreetly. It was a message from Hayes, at the cafe downstairs, watching your show. Natalie curled the corner of her mouth and flipped the phone face down. On stage, Evan concluded his presentation and entered the Q&A session. The first 3 questions were soft, market expectations, technical barriers, and collaboration intentions. Evan answered them fluently, each response drawing even warmer applause. Watching his cheeks flushed under the spotlight, Natalie felt as calm as a frozen lake inside. The 4th question came from a North American delegate, his voice carrying a distinct Boston accent. Mr. Evan, I'd like to ask about a technical detail. Regarding your company's Tianxian time series prediction module, is there a drift compensation issue in long-cycle data streams? I noticed that your publicly available technical white paper provides little detail on this matter, and the industry's recent hot topic, the open-source Phase 7 architecture, seems to have a more elegant solution to this problem. The venue fell silent for a moment. Natalie caught the almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of Evan's mouth. He knew this question hit a weak spot. His team had studied the open-source code of Phase 7, but no one had truly understood the underlying mathematical logic, let alone been able to replace it into Tianxian's existing framework. The technical team behind Evan began murmuring among themselves. Derek, the engineer Natalie had once recommended, was now standing next to the CTO, scrolling through a tablet with an expression of anxiety perfectly calibrated. Evan struggled to respond, offering some general remarks like we've done thorough optimizations and each has its pros and cons, but the professional audience began to frown. The North American delegate even pressed further, what about the specific data? The atmosphere in the venue shifted subtly, like a drop of ink suddenly falling into a pool of clear water. Natalie stood up at that moment. She wore a sharply tailored black suit dress. As she stood up, her chair made an almost inaudible thud against the carpet, but all eyes in the room instantly converged on her. People recognized her as the mysterious partner of Silver Creek, the key investor representative for Xingyuan's latest funding round, and also Evan's ex-wife. Mr. Evan, Natalie began, her voice soft yet carried clearly through the lapel microphone across the entire venue, gentle to the point of being considerate. As a special advisor, I believe I can help explain this issue. Evan's face paled a shade under the spotlight. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to stop her, but Natalie had already stepped onto the platform. As she passed him, she caught the familiar scent of his cologne, mingled now with the faint perspiration born of anxiety. She didn't look at him, walking straight to the demo station, her fingertips gliding lightly over the trackpad. The core logic of Phase 7 lies in dynamic timing compensation. Natalie's voice was steady and clear, as if she were explaining a problem in class. And the underlying engine of Tianxian can seamlessly integrate with this logic. For example, her fingers typed a line of commands. The code was only a few short lines, like an exquisitely crafted key slipping into the most vulnerable lock of Tianxian. The data stream on the big screen froze for a second, then everything changed. The curves collapsed layer by layer like toppled dominoes, the beautiful data waterfall dissolving into a mess of garbled code. Red warning boxes popped up one after another, like hazard lights suddenly flashing in the underground labyrinth of London. The timing drift issue, amplified 1,000-fold by the demonstration code Natalie had input, threw the entire system into a logical dead loop. The screen was left with nothing but endlessly scrolling error logs, line after line, stretching on without end. A deathly silence fell over the room. Then, an uproar. From the investor seats, someone stood up, another pulled out a phone and started making calls. The camera lenses zoomed in frantically, capturing both the shattered screen and Evan's pallid face in the live broadcast. Evan spun around to look at his CTO, the dark horse Natalie had planted 3 years early, who was staring at the massive screen in shock, muttering, "Impossible, there was no such issue during testing," his expression perfectly feigned to seem innocent. Vivian's aqua-green suit stood out sharply amidst the chaos. She tried to stand up and walk toward the stage, but was stopped by the security. Natalie stepped back from the demo table and turned to face the audience. Her gaze swept across Evan. He was staring at her intently, fear and collapse finally flickering in his eyes, like a skyscraper suddenly losing its foundation, tilting before her very eyes. "I'm sorry," Natalie said into the microphone, her voice still gentle. "It seems that the core of Tianxian relies more heavily on external logic than I anticipated. But that's fine, technical issues can always be resolved." She paused, gave a slight nod toward the camera, and added, "It just doesn't seem like a good day to continue the demonstration." She walked off the stage, cutting through glances that were anxious, angry, and bewildered, her back straight, her step steady. As she pushed open the door and left the venue, her phone vibrated continuously. The stock price had plunged off a cliff within 5 minutes, and news push notifications had already begun using the phrase Xingyuan technical incident. At the end of the hallway, Hayes leaned against the entrance of the cafe, holding a cup of black coffee. He raised it toward her in a toast. "Gentle," he said, a sharp, appreciative smile at the corner of his eyes. Natalie walked over, took the coffee from his hand, and took a sip, bitter enough to make her tongue go numb. "Death sentence," she corrected him. "What uses gentleness?" 3 months later, Xingyuan Technology entered bankruptcy liquidation proceedings. Natalie stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows on the 37th floor of the Goldman Sachs building, a cup of Earl Grey tea at the perfect temperature in her hand. Below her feet lay the chessboard-like streets of the City of London, cars weaving through like ants. And the Xingyuan logo that once graced the covers of financial magazines was now turning into a long string of red liquidation entries on the tablet in front of her. Hayes was seated at the desk behind her, on the phone, speaking in a calm tone to a Southeast Asian fund about licensing cooperation for the Phase 7 architecture. His silver-gray suit jacket was draped over the back of the chair, his shirt sleeves rolled up to mid-forearm, revealing the faint mark of a watch beneath. He ended the call, spun around in his swivel chair, and waved his phone at Natalie. Phase 7 has officially become the reference architecture for the EU's AI Temporal Sequence Standards draft, he said, a hint of barely concealed pride in his voice. Xingyuan's Tianxian has been recognized by the industry as the most textbook example of a wrong direction. Are you satisfied? Natalie turned to look at him, without a smile. The light from the window fell across her face, carving out sharply contrasting contours of light and shadow. She thought back to the snowy night of her previous life, to the painstaking work branded with Evan's name, to the final line of error logs on the screen as she collapsed on the lab floor. Standing in this building now, watching that man's empire being dismantled piece by piece, she felt a strange absence of the anticipated thrill. There was only a deep, calm exhaustion, like the hollow weakness in one's legs after finally crossing the finish line of a long-distance race. "Not yet," she said, her voice soft. "He'll come." Before he could finish, Hayes's assistant knocked and entered, a peculiar expression on her face. "Mr. Hayes, the front desk downstairs says there's a Mr. Evan, insisting on seeing Miss Natalie." Hayes raised an eyebrow at Natalie. Natalie placed her teacup on the windowsill, adjusted her shirt collar, and said, "Let him come up." 10 minutes later, Evan appeared at the office door. He had lost a lot of weight, his once neatly pressed suit now crumpled and clinging to his body, his tie crooked, and deep dark circles under his eyes. The man who once stood confidently on the Excel stage was gone, replaced by a haggard shell stripped of its backbone. The moment he saw Natalie, his eyes suddenly reddened, and his lips trembled several times before he could finally speak. "Natalie. I know I was wrong." Natalie leaned by the window, arms crossed, watching him with an expressionless face. Evan took 2 steps forward, but Hayes subtly blocked him, so he had to stop in place. His hand trembled in the air, reaching out and then retracting, like a drowning man trying to grab a floating log but failing. "Those codes. Phase 7. They were yours, weren't they? Derek was your man, and that investment was all part of your setup." His voice cracked, his logic scattered. "But why did you have to go this far? We were still husband and wife, Evan," Natalie interrupted him, her voice flat as a frozen lake. When you embezzled Xing Yuan's R&D funds for Vivian's gallery, did you think we were husband and wife? When you put your name on the core module I slaved over for 3 straight months, did you think we were husband and wife? When you left me alone in the lab on New Year's Eve and went to watch fireworks with her. She stopped. The old wound in her chest, torn open time and again, suddenly throbbed with a sharp pain, but she quickly stitched it shut with reason. I always thought, Evan suddenly burst into tears, tears streaming down his gaunt jaw, his voice hoarse, I always thought giving you money, letting you live in a nice house, buying you those bags and jewelry, that was love. I didn't know you wanted something else, Natalie. I didn't know those codes mattered so much to you. Natalie watched his tears. In her past life, she had dreamed of this scene countless times. In her dreams, she softened, forgave, repeated the cycle. But now, she found it nothing but absurd. Those tears came too late, so late they carried no weight, so late they weren't even worth a flicker of her brow. The only valuable thing you ever gave me, she said, each word like a nail forged in fire, was teaching me that before trusting anyone, I must first forge myself into a fortress. She turned and walked toward Hayes. With tacit understanding, Hayes shifted half a step sideways, shielding her behind him, and made a pleased gesture toward Evan. Supported by 2 security guards, Evan was led outside. As he passed through the doorway, he cast one last look back. Natalie and Hayes stood side by side in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the dazzling skyline of the financial district stretched out, making the woman who was once his wife look like an insurmountable ice peak. The door closed. The office fell silent, leaving only the faint hum of the central air conditioning. Hayes looked down at her. Natalie closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, the lingering moisture in them had already dried. Let's go, she said. It's stuffy in here. On the banks of the River Thames in the evening, the fog was slightly thinner than usual, and the lights on the opposite shore reflected on the water, shattering into a flowing patch of golden scales. Natalie and Hayes walked side by side along the riverside promenade, not holding hands, their shoulders separated by half a step, but that half step was filled with a wordless understanding. Occasionally, joggers passed them, the rhythmic tapping of their soles against the stone echoing in the air. In the distance, the silhouette of Big Ben grew increasingly blurred in the twilight, the chimes yet to strike the hour. Technical idealism, Natalie suddenly spoke, her voice carried by the river breeze to Hayes's ear. When you first proposed the collaboration, all I wanted was revenge. But the day Phase 7 truly became the industry standard, I suddenly felt, it should belong to everyone, not just a weapon for one person. Hayes turned his head to glance at her. His profile was outlined with a soft edge in the dusk, a stark contrast to his usually sharp businessman persona. And what about you now? He asked. The weapon has been used, what's next? Natalie stopped, gripping the railing of the embankment as she gazed across the river. The towers of the financial district were lighting up one by one, like chess pieces being illuminated in sequence. The Southeast Asian market, she said, the wind lifting the ends of her hair, the Phase 7 expansion architecture is far from reaching its ceiling. If Polaris is interested. Polaris has already poured 8 figures into it. Hayes stopped as well, standing beside her, his elbows propped on the railing as he turned to look at her. You know why I dared? Because I've seen you turn a bad hand into a winning move from start to finish. The technology is the hand you're dealt, you're the one playing it. Natalie turned her head, meeting his gaze. In his eyes were reflected the scattered lights of the river, and her own reflection as well. She suddenly remembered that handshake after the Knightsbridge cocktail party last winter, that electric, subtle sensation. It turned out what had been planted then wasn't some spark of collaboration, but a seed of being understood. She didn't say a word, only stepped half a pace closer and gently rested her head on Hayes's shoulder. The fabric of his shirt carried a sharp, cool scent of cedar, mingling with the river breeze and mist, unexpectedly grounding. Hayes didn't move, only tilted his head slightly, his jaw resting against the crown of her head. First time you've leaned into me on your own, he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. First time I felt like I could let my guard down, Natalie replied, her eyes still closed. The river breeze swept past her ears, and in the distance, Big Ben finally chimed the dusk hour. The deep, resonant bell tones spread through the mist, blanketing the entire city. Listening to the bells and Hayes' steady heartbeat, Natalie's eyelids grew heavy. It had been so long since she had closed her eyes like this, so peacefully. Her last stretch of sleep over 4 hours seemed like a year ago. Back then, she had sat alone by the floor-to-ceiling window in South Kensington, faced with a full screen of data, an empty apartment behind her. It's different now. Her breathing grew shallow, and she actually rested on that shoulder for a few minutes. Hayes hadn't moved. His right hand came off the railing and settled gently on the railing behind her, forming a faint, encircling gesture of protection. In the distance, a few tourists were raising their cameras to capture the river view, their lenses sweeping past them unintentionally. From a half-dreamy state, Natalie registered the scene: 2 people standing side by side, a city draped in twilight, a river flowing toward the harbor. "Hayes," she said, eyes still closed, her voice muffled, "where do you think we're going next?" Hayes lowered his head, his lips nearly brushing the top of her hair. His voice was soft, as if stating a plan already set for tomorrow: Southeast Asia. Or farther. Whose foundation you want to tear down, I'll go with you. Natalie let out a quiet laugh against his shoulder, as light as a patch of shimmering light on a river stirred by the wind. She didn't reply, but her hand slipped out of her coat pocket and gently grasped the cuff of his sleeve hanging by his side. It was a small, very quiet gesture, more about confirmation than declaration, confirming that someone in this world could finally understand the equations she wrote, confirming that those pearls trampled underfoot as fish eyes could indeed be picked up one by one and reassembled into a new tower. Outside the window, the lights of the fog city flickered on one by one, spreading out into a gentle and vast chessboard. The Phase 7 Foundation, co-founded by Natalie and Hayes, established its Asia-Pacific headquarters in Singapore that autumn. At an industry conference, when asked, "How do you define success?" Natalie looked into the camera and said, "So that every pearl no longer has to pretend to be a fish eye just to survive." Hayes watched her from below the stage and raised his glass amidst the applause.